Question Lane. Solving problems through the process of questions and answers.
This podcast, The Question Lane, it's a podcast where we try to focus on solving problems through the process of questions and answers. In this particular episode, I want to focus on Area 2, education. Specifically, I want to focus on your article, How Dual Enrollment Contributes to Inequality. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Gilbert.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay, what would you like for me to refer to you as? Professor Gilbert, Eric, or
Eric,
do you have a
fine.
specific name?
Nah, Eric.
Okay, perfect.
It's fine.
Perfect. Is there anything you want our audience to know about you before we get started?
Well, I'm not I kind of came late to working on higher education policy issues. I kind of made a move into what is now called critical university studies, but my original training is in East African and Indian Ocean history, 19th and 20th century. So I'm not trained in political science. I don't do social science methods or anything like that. So everything I have to say is pretty much me reading other people's research articles. It's not based on me going out and doing, statistically sophisticated studies of things. I kind of look at lists and see what's at the top, that kind of thing, rather than being a real social sciences researcher.
So basically, you analyze research that you see on topics that you're interested in, and you provide your opinion pieces on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
And so I use sort of historian skills to. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to just say I use kind of a historian's critical reading skills to approach problems that are not specifically historical. And so, although everything, of course, is historical from a historian's perspective.
Why did you become a professor in history? What motivated you to put yourself in that type of discipline and focus on that as a career path?
Well, it's kind of a convoluted route. I was originally a classicist. I did Greek and Latin. And I realized, I did Greek and Latin, and then I spent a bunch of time as a ski bum. And when I decided I needed a grown-up job, I thought originally the logical thing for me to do was to become a high school history teacher. And I kind of started down that path and realized that I really would not be a good high school history teacher. So I applied for a history graduate program. And when it came time to work on a PhD, I had grown up in West Africa. My father worked for USAID, the Agency for International Development. So I spent most of my childhood in West Africa. And then when I was college age, my parents were living in East Africa. And so when it came time for me to look into a PhD program, I already had some African language training. I could speak French and a little bit of Swahili. And it seemed like a natural path to go into East Africa, Indian Ocean stuff. So that's how I ended up going that route.
What countries did you stay in while you were in Africa?
Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon. And then when I was in college, my parents were stationed in Tanzania. So I spent my summers and Christmases in Tanzania. I never lived there full time, except later on. I was a Fulbrighter in Zanzibar, which is sort of a semi-autonomous part of Tanzania. And then later on, my parents were in Sudan and Cote d'Ivoire. And I spent a couple of weeks in each of those places visiting them, but I've never lived in either of those countries. But we moved to Ghana when I was 2, so I spent most of kind of grade school years in Ghana and Nigeria, middle school, Cameroon, and then I went to high school in the U.S. because there was no English language high school in Cameroon when we were there.
You are a white male, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What was your experience like growing up in that type of environment where you saw people that were so different from you economically, I guess physically, and all of those different metrics?
Well, it's hard. That's a very common question. People will ask, what was it like having a childhood like that? But when it's the only childhood you've had, it's hard to compare it to other childhoods or other lives. So for me, that's just sort of normal, or it was normal. I think the biggest difference, I think particularly even the biggest difference compared to what that experience would be like now. I mean, we're talking about we moved to Ghana in 1966. So independence in Ghana was 1958. So that was, less than a decade from independence. And when we got to Nigeria, I think Nigeria got its independence in 1964. And we moved there in 1970. And so, the situation was still far more colonial than it would be now. There were still fairly large numbers of people, Britons and other Europeans who had sort of stayed on in those places after independence. And I believe, particularly in Nigeria, that's less true now. Now, and Ghana, of course, had a substantial African middle class, and it sort of goes back to the colonial period. And so Ghana's kind of unusual. And so my parents' social circle was had a lot of European or U.S. educated Ghanaians in it. There are a surprising number of Ghanaians in the 60s who had gone to school in the U.S., sometimes on scholarships and things like that, but sometimes just because their families could afford to send them. Ghana had the cocoa industry had produced a fairly large African middle class. And so it was commonplace for us in Ghana for as a child to have African friends visiting and things like that to visit my parents. That was somewhat true in Nigeria. It was much less true in Tanzania. And I don't know if that was because of how things had changed by the 80s, or if it's just a different sort of. There was a smaller African middle class in Tanzania. It had always been a somewhat poorer country than either Ghana or Nigeria. It hadn't had the sort of colonial era investment that a place like Ghana had had. I think it was different in different countries. And on some level, being a sort of a white child in West Africa in the 60s and 70s, you're a minority, but you're a very privileged minority. There's still enough kind of a colonial era deference that there were still elements of that in circulation in the 80s that I think would not, or the 60s and 70s, that would not be present anymore. I think that's really changed.
And just to follow up quickly on what you said about colonialism, can you briefly explain what that is and in a few sentences and try to inform our viewers on what you mean when you use the term colonialism?
Okay, well, Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon were all colonies of European countries. In the case of Ghana and Nigeria, it was the British, and Cameroon was colonized by both first by the Germans, and then after World War I, Germany was forced to give up all of its colonies after World War I, and the British and the French, who had defeated the Germans in World War I, divided up Cameroon into a British sector and a German sector, British sector and a French sector. But that in West Africa, colonialism mostly meant sort of administration by the colonial power, Ghana and Nigeria. That would have been the British. There weren't a whole lot of settlers. There weren't. It's not like colonial North America or even colonial South America, where you had large numbers of Europeans moving in and taking up residence. That didn't happen a lot in West Africa. Is mostly the kind of governmental structure was European. In East Africa, Kenya in particular, there was a substantial white settler population, which produces a really different dynamic when you have farms being owned by Europeans. Tanzania had a small settler population, some Germans and then some Britons who had come after Tanzania had also started out as a German colony, and then became a British colony after World War I. Technically, it was a League of Nations mandate, but it was, for all intents and purposes, a colony. So Tanzania was a little different in that it had a small settler population, farmers, but not nearly the scale that Kenya or Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, or South Africa had. So in all those cases, you have a European power that comes in, takes over by one mechanism or another, and then sets up a government there, and sort of manages things usually in ways that are meant to benefit the economy of the mother country, in Britain or France, in terms of producing raw materials for British industry or French industry. In the case of Nigeria, they tried to produce cotton to sell to British textile manufacturers. In the case of Ghana, it's less kind of clear tie to European industry. They were, or British industry. In Ghana, they were producing mostly cocoa for chocolate, but a few other agricultural products for export.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay up to date for more videos by clicking the bell notification icon and following our social media. For any of the people, groups, companies, or videos that were referenced in this video, don't forget to check the description and or the pinned comment section. The Question Lane, solving problems through the process of questions and answers.